All right, and welcome to another episode of Further Inquiry. Today, I'm joined by Jeremy Rothe-Kushel. He is what I would like to describe as a citizen analyst and has done a lot of work in activism and also analysis, especially as it relates to things such as the Israel-Palestine conflict, Russia, 9/11, you name it. So, Jeremy, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing fine myself. It's a nice Sunday here in Florida, so something to look forward to.
That's good.
All
It's starting to cool down a little bit here in the radical middle of America in Lawrence, Kansas.
all right, but let's get right into it. For our audience, can you explain a bit of your background, like specifically what got you interested in issues like the Israel-Palestine conflict and Russia, and like maybe also how those things interconnect?
Definitely. So some of this goes back, I guess, early on, but I'll try to be quick. But I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, and grew up in a sort of mixed ethnic background in terms of my family, but mainly Jewish. And I remember during the 80s was introduced to politics by maybe the Iran-Contra affairs being played on the radio when I was riding with my mom in the car, and also went to a march, a nuclear sort of nuclear freeze march, or during the 80s at some point. And so those were the sort of the beginnings of some of my political consciousness. And then I ended up going to college in the Northeast, in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts, Williams College, and studying religion there, actually, and was still very politically interested and took politics courses. And actually I took a year off from college after my sophomore year and worked with Peace Action, which is a peace lobbying group. So it sort of comes out of the Quakers, and actually was related to that earlier march of nuclear freeze, sane freeze. And so began to get a little bit more on the ground experience then. And then, so, I graduated right before September 11th. It happened a few months later. And after I graduated, I lived with a friend in southern Vermont, and we were sort of isolated in terms of media. We didn't have internet for a while. We just got a few radio stations. So, pick up on an NPR affiliate and then little bits of Pacifica Network, and hear interviews with Noam Chomsky by Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, and was always a little bit suspicious of sort of the way that September 11th was contextualized in the press immediately, and this idea of like Bin Laden, the boogeyman, and we don't know where he is, and all of that kind of stuff. But I never really heard much about that. There were maybe deeper inquiries into the deeper historical context and the actual operational depth and width of the September 11th operation for a few years after that. And then so I moved back to Los Angeles in 2005 and actually went back to work with Peace Action, and with a strong focus on the Iraq War that was really raging at that point, and speaking with people on the ground, including working in interfacing with different kinds of political campaigns, sometimes confronting politicians with questions about how they would approach the military budget, the war in Iraq, all of that kind of stuff. And at that time, I began to hear more about different inquiries into September 11th and begin to explore those and read a lot. And then help start a We Are Change LA chapter in Los Angeles out of a other 9/11 Truth, what's called 9/11 Truth Group. Now, there's all kinds of looking back issues with these groups, all of them basically. I would say that that I've worked with in helped start these kinds of things, and wasn't really very aware in those years, maybe the 2005 to 2010-ish kind of years, that much about the nature of Russian information warfare, the fact that the Russians still had a pretty substantial military industrial complex of their own, a long-standing intelligence core, and I definitely did not really understand the nature of the relationship between Russia and Israel, although I was getting more and more interested and aware of the deeper background of Israel and Israel-Palestine and Israel in relationship to the war on terror and Israel and 9/11 during those years. And then moved to Kansas with my wife as we were about to have our son, and around 2012, and begin to continue to explore these issues. And then a few years later, met a friend and colleague, Greg McCarran, on Twitter, and we actually started a podcast in 2016 called The Antidote, where we began to really explore deep politics in a way where we would recontextualize it, try to destigmatize areas that had been turned into maybe cartoonish conspiracy theory. And in the context of our investigations into the deeper background of the rise of what became known as the MAGA movement and Trump's first presidency, that we then called the 11/9 operation, in resonance with 9/11, 11/9 being the date in November of 2016 that Trump was announced to have won the presidency, and then also drafting off of, as a response of Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 11/9, where he'd made a previous film called Fahrenheit 9/11 that seemed to limit the hangout and decontextualize some of the deeper questions around September 11th, and made a film, Fahrenheit 11/9, that seemed to limit the hangout around questions of the deeper potential transnational intelligence operations that was long-standing in terms of creating this moment in the American body politic, and especially in terms of the nature of certain specific foreign players, such as Netanyahu's Israel and Putin's Russia in all of that. And so since that time, also, I helped start I think it might be it was the first terrestrial American radio show that was specifically oriented on covering Israel-Palestine. That's now known as Understanding Israel-Palestine. And that was in 2019. And I've just rejoined the production team there that's broadcast out of Kansas City. And so that then lent itself to me engaging even more deeply in terms of specifically the backgrounds of political Zionism, Israel-Palestine, what's now known as the Israel-Palestine conflict, and then, of course, October 7th and this subsequent so-called response by Israel to October 7th. And so in all of that, what's beginning to emerge more and more strongly in my mind as a hypothesis is that this axis between Russia and Israel is really maybe the crucial missing piece of understanding, especially from an American context, especially looking back over what we call the Cold War, but all the way back through the founding of Israel and the growth of the founding of Israel into what we now know as the U.S.-Israel special relationship, and how there looks to have been strategic deception operations that were being run at that point out of the Soviet sphere, and I think that continues on, maybe even escalates to this current day from the Russian sphere, to use Israel and more generally the Israel-Palestine so-called conflict as not only as a conduit back and forth from Russia into the West and the United States specifically, but also as a way to create and maintain and almost manufacture and escalate the Israel-Palestine conflict as a geopolitical weight around the West's and the American neck, and that the American national security state, in addition to having been penetrated heavily by both Russian and Israeli aggressive espionage operations over decades, has fallen into these larger strategic gambits, I would say, as facilitated by some of our own domestic elements, maybe from the post 9/11 context. So we could call it the neoconservative movement, and all of that. And so that's some of the background of how I got to this current moment.
Wow, that's quite a journey. Like, you definitely have more experience than I have, and definitely a brighter mind than I do. Um, you mentioned Israel's response. I personally wouldn't call it a response. It's just a war of extermination at this point.
That's right.
Now, have have you noticed in recent years, alternate media has become very pro-Russian, and in your opinion, when did this first begin? Because I remember when I was younger, alternate media like was maybe critical of maybe all governments in general, especially the bigger ones, whether it be the U.S., whether it be Russia, the Britain, or whatever you want to name. But today it's just it's critical of only the West, but is very pro Russian, or at the very least not as critical of maybe Russia, China.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because I think that we can see the context and the basis of this current moment that you're describing all along the way, especially in terms of the Russian sphere, I think. And I also want to say that I agree with your typification in terms of what the nature of what Israel is actually doing in alleged response to October 7th. This all to me appears to have been premeditated to a large extent, and that this is really an attempt to to genocide the Palestinian nation and sort of a final solution to the Palestinian question. And I think that's very true. And so what I would point out is that there has always been this attempt by what's been called the alternative media to limit the hangout in terms of these crucial deep events. So, and I would say October 7th is one of these deep events. September 11th is another one of these deep events, but also the Moscow 1999 bombings that really facilitated the entrenchment of Vladimir Putin as a sort of former KGB strongman of Russia. That all of these kinds of deep events have always been, the hangout has been limited. There's been a ton of misinformation and disinformation throughout the entire span, left to right, right to left, of the alternative media sphere, and very often, especially in obscuring the role of key players that are often operating out of Russia and Israel. So some of this goes back to the 60s in many ways in terms of the Cold War and the dynamics of the Soviet Union and the United States in a bipolar alleged conflict between two just major powers, and that's the bulk of the Cold War. So then you can understand why then certain dissident press, alternative press, dissidents, political activists in the United States at that point, who are in many ways legitimately calling their own government and their own society to account to improve itself morally, economically, politically, also become ripe for to become what the Soviets would have called useful idiots or fellow travelers, and some of them were actually just sort of actually became agents of some sort. And so I think that is actually some of the background of how potentially Russian the alternative media has been because of some of its origins in the Cold Wars. And I'll just say that a key piece of my operating hypothesis right now is that this orthogonal relationship between the United States and Israel, which was also catapulted and really firmly established around this exact same time of the Cold War, especially the 60s, the assassinations of the 60s, the USS Liberty attack, the relationship being firmed up after that attack between the United States and Israel, that this orthogonal relationship between the United States and Israel who also became this key missing piece of what was actually what I would call a triangleton, referring to James Jesus Angleton, the head of U.S. counterintelligence for almost 2 decades, but also the head of the Israel desk. And that this has serviced and continues to serve as this key, almost like a binary cognitive weapon of some sort, that the alternative media, to very substantial proportions, it is either directly tied into or have become assets of agents of sorts, but definitely at the very least have played into these kinds of strategic setups as useful idiots. But I will say that I think it is correct that especially the sort of frontal left alternative and the frontal right alternative media have become supercharged in terms of their role in sort of putting everything on the head of the Western New World Order, the Atlanticists, the American Empire. And in so doing, they also tend to repeat and echo the informational warfare perspectives of what I would call the multipolar New World Order imperial attempt, which is very much includes more of this sort of triangleton kind of approach, where you have a very Russian, Israeli, occupied American, post-empire being set up to become some kind of post-constitutional regional power of some sort, and then Russia and China running the East, and all of these so-called poles then dominating the entire southern hemisphere of the world, while Israel sits in the middle of the Mackinder world island in terms of, more than a century-long geopolitical hypothesis of how crucial that area is, and becomes the middle player, or the middle pole of the entire arrangement. And so I'll just finish up by saying that I think it's become very obvious now that that someone like Alex Jones at InfoWars, especially in the run up in the decade of the run up to the Trump and the MAGA operation, that he really became an outpost of Russia Today stories, and people can go just look at the facts behind that InfoWars became one of the biggest syndicators. Now, they were an unofficial syndicator, I think. I don't think they were being paid or anything like that necessarily directly to rebroadcast and republish stories from Russia Today. But they ended up doing that, and then on up to now, where we see, the Tenet media scandal, where all of these so-called sort of new right or alternative right media figures are wrapped up in being backed directly by a Russian state cutout operation to facilitate the kinds of stories and perspectives, it looks like, that would service those interests. And of course, it's very similar kinds of, maybe more like fellow traveler kinds of relationships, rather than useful idiots in a certain way, exist on the left. And that's where you see a lot of like some people who are called the leading lights of, like, being anti-Zionist, or especially post October 7th critical of Israel, and like people like Norman Finkelstein or Max Blumenthal, who seem to repeat and service the interests of the multipolar sphere of the world order, and maybe especially Russia. And one last thing is that you can sort of see an interesting split in terms of the gray zone between Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, where Ben Norton goes with China, and Max Blumenthal appears to go with Russia to some extent. And this is seen as one of the leading members of the left alternative media establishment.
Yeah, I remember seeing something along the lines of, I guess Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton had a bit of a nasty fallout, even to the point where um, I guess like on one of their trips, Blumenthal video recorded Norton as they were on a bus, just accusing him of whatever it was that was going on between them, and yeah, it led to them splitting up in a nasty way. But also, of course, we have people like Alex Jones who have been parroting Russian talking points for God knows how long now, and it culminated to a recent debate between him and a pro-Israeli but also pro-Ukraine guy, Drew Pavlu, debating him on his show. And of course, Jones was just bringing up whataboutisms constantly. Now, some in alternate media, whether it be people like Scott Ritter, Ryan Dawson, or as you also mentioned, Max Blumenthal, Ben Norton, maybe also people like Douglas McGregor, for instance, they claim to be anti-war, but also critical of Israel, and yet are also supportive of Russia's actions in Israel, or at the very least, maybe just not as critical of Russia's actions. Why is this the case, in your opinion?
Well, the question of why is a very interesting one. I think it's obvious that you're correct in terms of your typification of all of this. And I would just first say that how this moment, especially post October 7th, and and with what Israel continues to do genocidally in Gaza, has really made this very strange kind of almost sort of obviously hypocritical kind of split become very clear in those ways, because a lot of those people that you talked about are very, very clear that they some of them will maybe sort of denounce the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a bad response to NATO aggression or something like that, but they will never actually make the actual geopolitical parallel that both the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli so-called invasion of Gaza, as if it were actually a war. It's not a war, as you seem to understand too, but that both of these kinds of hostilities have been engaged by the commanding heights of the country that is doing the invading, and so there's a very direct parallel here in many ways. So the question of why, I think, is a very interesting one, and it goes into understanding the way that espionage works, actually, and understanding things like counterintelligence frameworks, like the acronym MICE, right, which comes largely out of the background, I think, of like U.S. counterintelligence during the Cold War, where MICE, M stands for money, I stands for ideology, C stands for compromise or coercion, and then E stands for ego. And that these are all factors that can be used when someone is looking to recruit either an agent or an asset, right? And so you can have an asset, for example. An agent is someone who is actually been overtly tasked in a covert fashion by an intelligence officer of some sort, and often there'll actually be some kind of actual documentation of this. There'll be potentially a direct payment of some sort or a quid pro quo and all this. But an asset could be someone who could also be paid. There could be a more unofficial but sort of a sack of cash kind of operation, or a promise of certain kinds of platforming or resources that are going to be put behind you. But there's also an unknowing asset potential there, where someone could be cultivated because of the nature of their idea, all of these MICEs. So that it could be, sort of, using their interest in their employment or to gain, money or payment or something like that, but in an unofficial or covert kind of way, such as Tenet Media. I think that it's very possible that at least some of the people down the road from people like Lauren Chen and her husband, who were knowingly conduiting this operation, it is very possible that that some of the other people, like the Tim Pools or the Dave Rubins, and I don't know about Benny Johnson and all these kinds of people, but some of them at least have some kind of credible credible deniability that they can employ to say that well, I didn't know exactly who was giving me this money and why. I thought it was just because they liked the work we were doing. They wanted to be involved with us. And so those kind of people, you can see that things like ego and ideology of some sort can be used as a way to cultivate them. Now, there's other people, such as like a Scott Ritter. I'm suspicious of Scott Ritter's background in terms of, it's on the public record that he says he was entrapped by, U.S. FBI, basically, and certain, police networks, potentially intelligence, in terms of, online attempted, procuring of underage girls for sex acts or something like that. Now, he says that he denies that he had any intent to go through with things and that he was dealing with his own psychology at the time and all of that. But the fact that is something that he would actually, quote unquote, fall into, then can help us look back at some of his earlier history, which I think really calls into question whether Scott Ritter is just a good faith dissident who is now sort of fallen into Russian spheres because they are fellow travelers and he believes the American empire is the most dangerous threat in the world and all of these kinds of things, to something questioning about like what was Scott Ritter doing in the 80s when he was a nuclear arms inspector involved in negotiations in the Soviet Union. He apparently met a young, at that point, very young, like, maybe just barely, 18, 20, something like that, translator when he went to the Soviet Union. And of course, like, translation at those kinds of high levels are obviously going to have intelligence interests. They're going to have Kremlin interests. And so, this translator had gone to a KGB school, the well-recognized KGB school for learning how to be a translator and all of that. And then it ends up, I think Scott Ritter ends up like, that becomes his wife, and so there's there's questions here that, like, I don't know about Douglas McGregor, for example, in terms of his actual background. But to me, it's obvious that McGregor is pushing information that is obviously false sometimes. And he'll use like certain Twitter accounts that are historically known for just pushing straight up disinformation and tell everybody to go read it and all of that. And I'll just, say also that a lot of these people were also the ones who accused the U.S. State Department of being like Alex Jones conspiracy theorists when, elements of the U.S. State Department were warning of an upcoming Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they called them conspiracy theorists and then said, well, we just didn't see it coming, and all of that. So your question is deep, and I think it's difficult to fully parse out in a short amount of time, and we would have to go sort of one by one. But I think at a larger scale, the most important thing is to understand network warfare architecture and thematics and meme warfare and culture warfare, and these kinds of things, and then see how all of these different kinds of characters and also called alternative media networks fit within that larger architecture.
I mean, as a follow-up to that, I mean, I mentioned, was it Ryan Dawson as well? Like, I mean, in your opinion, do a lot of like these like pro-Russian individuals who are also like, they claim to be anti-war, like, in your opinion, like, are they genuinely probably good faith, but just maybe just misinformed? Because Ryan Dawson, in my opinion, like, I think he is genuinely anti-war, but just at the same time, and I applaud him, for speaking up for the Palestinians, but at the same time, it just seems hypocritical on his part to be supportive of Russia as well, especially with what they're doing to Ukraine.
Well, I agree, and I think that with every single person who contributes to public analysis, I think it's important to take everything with a grain of salt, but also to understand where and how people contribute and how everybody has their downsides, for example. With Ryan Dawson, there's a historical problem here in terms of his relationship with the Russian and Iranian media spheres, right? And for someone like Dawson, I do think there's a deeper background of good faith in terms of I do think he is actually anti-neocon, let's say, or anti-war, and he really is on the side of stopping the genocide against the Palestinians. And yet, because of his specific circumstances, he has sought influence and platforming wherever he can find it sometimes, and that is included in the Russian sphere, the Iranian sphere. He even sort of sidled up to David Duke, who notoriously also sidled up to the Russians and had a Moscow apartment for many years. In addition to all the questions about his background with the Ku Klux Klan, which is an interesting parallel with Ryan Dawson, because a key part of Ryan Dawson's American historical context is sort of as a Civil War revanchist of some sort. And so there's a strange parallel with Ryan Dawson saying that he sort of sidled up to David Duke just because he needed money at the time or needed exposure in order to gain his audience back after being censored on on mainstream social media platforms and all of that, and that they both come from this background of being neo-Confederate, or at least sort of American Civil War reactionary, revisionist, revanchist of some sort, with David Duke actually being a part of an organization, the Ku Klux Klan, that to me looks like it really does come out of a combination of, highest levels of Confederate intelligence, the Knights of the Golden Circle, the Judeo-Masonic B'nai B'rith, and all of that. So with Ryan Dawson, I think this Russia question is a major problem for him. And because it's obvious that, okay, although Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not as criminal and nationally genocidal as what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but also part of a larger plan to basically sort of create the smaller part of greater Israel in terms of the West Bank, Gaza, all becoming part of the known borders of Israel and all of that. That Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been pretty violent and pretty bad for the Ukrainian people, including children too. Now, it's obviously not at the levels of Netanyahu in Gaza, for example, but it's the same kind of archetype that they've all, and someone especially like Brian Dawson, has tried to explain away. And I even, confronted Dawson about how soon after October 7th, he and Scott Ritter were attempting to obscure what I thought were the really crucial questions and data points that actually could expose October 7th and what's still being done to the Palestinians in Gaza before it got really pitched up, by pointing out that this is part of some kind of larger operation that the Netanyahu regime is running, has been running. And instead, Ritter and Dawson seem to want to push some kind of like culture war, anti-woke kind of framework about how it was women border guards next to Israeli women border guards next to Gaza that caused this alleged missing of intelligence and all of that. Whereas the reality of it, it was actually sort of the opposite, that it was actually largely women Gaza border guards who were actually raising some of the concerns that were then either quote unquote missed, or I would say very likely deliberately ignored because of this larger operation that was going. And so they've done that, and even more so in terms of the long history of how the Putin's Russian invasion of Ukraine was largely premeditated. It goes back decades in terms of its intent, It was manufactured in a similar kind of way, like the dirty war of Syria was manufactured in terms of Russian involvement in the Donbass, at least over the last decade, if not before that. So with someone like Ryan Dawson, I think that the question of Russia and Ukraine really calls the question to these larger problems with Ryan Dawson when it comes to even things like September 11th and October 7th.
Hmm. Now, moving on, can you explain the relationship between Israel and Russia? Like, how would you personally characterize it? Like, is it one of like covert support? Is it one of overt support? Maybe a bit of both, or is it something else entirely?
It's some of both, and it's increasingly overt. But I think that to understand it, you have to go back to the beginnings of Israel itself, and now what we've gotten from the Matrokin archives, which were brought by a former Soviet archivist after the Cold War was over to the UK, and some of these files help expose the fact that the Soviet intelligence was using maybe their highest level, at least British mole, Kim Philby, to actually aid the Zionist terrorists in targeting and successfully attacking the British at the King David Hotel, which most people see as if not the crucial so-called military moment that established Israel before the war in 1948, basically. And so, part of that then would help us understand that this relationship that the Soviets had with the Israel-Palestine is largely not just created in after the Cold War. That there was, at the very least, prior to Israel being founded, the Soviets had interest, and this makes total geopolitical sense because, at that point, World War II had ended, and it was becoming clear that there was a face-off of a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West, and mainly, what they called the main enemy was the United States, and so there was lots of interest in targeting the Anglo-Americans and driving them out in many ways from Palestine and the Middle East, but also destabilizing their presence there. And so I think this sets a background to understand that, because the actual, Zionist terrorists who did the King David Hotel bombing, they are the exact, legacy of what Netanyahu comes from. They're the origins of the Likud party. It's people like Menachem Begin, who's really one of the founders of the Likud party. And so this real deep background of the Soviets with using at least, these what become the Likud Zionist terrorists who are been now in the commanding heights of the Israeli government for decades, let's say, from the very beginning, I think discloses that they had an interest in not only then supporting the Palestinian organized, I would say, so-called opposition, which has now become, it was very clear for decades, actually, that, now we know someone like Mahmoud Abbas from Palestinian, so-called authority leadership. He was identified from Syrian archives as a KGB asset. The PFLP were known to have been, steered or aligned with the Soviet sphere. But then even going up to Hamas and the approach to October 7th, you see that Hamas leadership went to Moscow, about around a year before October 7th. And then I saw one of the Hamas leadership on Arabic speaking TV. I can't remember who it was, but he very specifically said, and this was like in the days after October 7th, that the Kremlin was very happy with this because it would actually take, with Western eyes, off of Ukraine and Russia. And so So, so some of this stuff is very difficult to say, to prove, because it looks to me like to be like long-term, high-level strategic thinking where you're not going to ever get any kind of full documentation or factual proof, definitely not in a criminal kind of way, that any of this is going. But on the surface of it, it's very obvious that there's been this heightened relationship even after the Cold War between Russia and Israel, and especially between Putin and Netanyahu. And in that decade, that leads to 11/9, Trump, MAGA, and all that, Putin and Netanyahu met face to face I think more than 10 times. They probably, in the 21st century, Putin and Netanyahu have probably met each other face to face more than any other two leaders in the entire world. And so now I guess I'll just finish up by saying that I think that it's what has gone from a more covert kind of relationship where we didn't learn about things like Kim Philby, Soviet mole's key role in the counterintelligence destabilization against the British in order to make the King David Hotel bombing successful on behalf of the Irgun and the Lehi that ultimately become the Likud for decades after, until the Cold War. So that part has been covert, but now what's becoming more overt is after Donald Trump had US B-2 bombers bomb Iranian nuclear sites, and all of these very sort of Russian sphere, so-called axis of resistance types on the internet and Twitter were saying Iran and Russia have signed a 20-year security agree, and Russia will have Iran's back and all of that. And it looks like the Iranian phone calls to Russia after the Iran had been, helping the Russians a lot in their military effort in Ukraine in terms of providing them drones and all of that. But the Iranians never got a call back from Russia, it looks like, in asking for help in terms of their own security as they were facing this Israeli-U.S. Attack against them. And then after the fact, Putin was asked, well, what happened? Why didn't you really, protect Iran against this bombing campaign? And he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Israel is a Russian country, he said. We have millions of our people there, millions of Russian speakers there. And so, and then I guess last little point I'll make is that just recently there was this arrest of a top Israeli cyber defense official in Las Vegas for a similar kind of, alleged crime that Scott Ritter was taken to task for, in terms of attempt to procure an underage girl using the internet. And he actually is also a Russian speaker. So at the commanding heights of the Israeli security architecture, there are Russian speakers and people who come out of the Russian sphere, and so it's now just becoming apparent that Israel is at the very least seen by Russia as being underneath, to some extent, what we might call the Russian Krisha, the organized crime idea of being under their roof to some extent. And when it came down to it, and Putin had to so-called decide between backing Iran and backing Israel, he chose Israel in the moment. And now I would say that now that's opening. There's been a decision to bring China to be Iran's main patron, and that they can handle that file because of the fact that they have a still more clandestine friendly relationship with Israel than Russia does at this point, having now almost fully uncloaked.
Now, what would you say led to the rise of Vladimir Putin? Would you say that maybe Western powers are in some way to blame for his rise, or was it mainly internal factors? Because I remember seeing an article from a British publication, I think it was the Daily Mail or something like that, I'm not too sure, that said I guess MI6 helped facilitate his rise. But what are your thoughts on the matter?
Well, I think it's both. This is sort of a similar parallel to the nature of successful Soviet operations in the American body politic and political and social spheres during the Cold War, maybe especially during like the 60s, and that it's not like the Soviets created the American civil rights problem, that came to the foray in the 60s. It's not like the Soviets really created the problem of the escalation of the war in Vietnam, especially after Kennedy was assassinated, for example. But they totally took advantage of these kinds of issues that the American body politic was struggling with internally. And so there's some kind of strange inverse to that in terms of the rise of Vladimir Putin in relationship to things that the West did to post-Soviet Russia, let's say. And obviously the role of what we call the Harvard boys in going in and really it looks like sort of creating some kind of neoliberal gangster sort of state situation in many ways, rather than actually facilitate the voices inside of Russia who wanted to pursue something like more like liberal democracy of some sort and political freedom rather than just what they call economic free markets or something like that. That played a key role in creating the kind of power vacuum and the instability in Russia, out of which a strong man such as Vladimir Putin, who comes up through the former Soviet national security apparatus, and its relationship also with organized crime too, in terms of his background in Moscow at the municipal level, and his he had some of the file of managing the relationship with Russian organized crime during that time. So from my understanding that it was a both and kind of scenario, but I would suggest that what the rise of Vladimir Putin really represents is the resurgence of the Soviet deep state that then becomes the Russian deep state, where it's put back on its feet in a certain way. Because the definition of the idea of a deep state, and there are multiple deep states that are associated with states that have names, for example, is that the deep state represents the national security architecture on the top side of it, especially the covert arms or the sort of covert intelligence arms of the national security apparatus on the top side, and then how that then interfaces with the underside, which is the criminal underworld very often. The mobbed up economies, black economy, also interfaces with what we know as oligarchs, who always sit at the sort of top of the bottom half of the deep state. And so I guess I would say that what Vladimir Putin did, and I believe he was very likely the emissary of what's known as the Siloviki, of a prior standing KGB elite inside of the Soviet security state, who wanted to maintain the core, Russian security state interests, and potentially even Soviet and even prior existing Russian imperial interests in terms of reestablishing the Russian deep state as not having the sort of oligarchs and the mobsters, many of which had been somewhat at least facilitated by the West and the Harvard boys and their neoliberalization and all of that sitting at the top. They wanted to put themselves, the security state, the Siloviki, the actual Russian state power set at the top, and then discipline the underside of the deep state, the oligarchs and the organized crime syndicates, as being underneath them. And so I think that's what we can see. The rise of Vladimir Putin represents the standing of the Russian deep state back on its feet in many ways by the end of the 1990s.
Now, how would you characterize Putin's domestic policies? And also, would you say the mainstream political opposition in Russia, I mean those that are operating in the Duma, would you say that they're largely under the control of the Kremlin in your view?
That's my sense of it. Now, I don't know. I haven't studied this Russian domestic politics that much, so I wouldn't make any sort of strong claims saying that I know this. But it does look to me like, especially from what we know from the background of the rise of, of postmodern political warfare in the figure of someone like Vladislav Surkov, and in the film Hypernormalization by Adam Curtis, and some of the deeper research that I've done into Surkov's role in basically being Putin's political czar, political theater czar. And Surkov himself was a theater kid, was actually studied theater at a high level. And so, yes, so in what we see then thereafter, I think, is that it's obvious that, of course, there are actual Russian dissidents and there are, actual political, um, you know, differences from the grassroots of Russia. But it does look like that most every piece of Russian domestic politics is, at the very least, part of a theater strategy, the theater of political war, right? So it's, the fact that we call war sites theater is an indication that, at the highest level of war, right? I don't know if what that was it Clausewitz who basically said that war is just an extension of politics. I think that's very obvious in many ways. And so even then political warfare is just an extension of politics. And so if it's in the hands, from this background in Russia, Putin's great Cardinal Surkov, of a theater kid, then I do think that, like, it to me, it does look like that it's largely theatrical in terms of any potential response or serious critique or political movement that would propose an alternative to the Siloviki rule and Putin's rule. And the last thing I'll say, too, is that one of the ways that, going back to your previous question, one of the ways that Putin sealed, or Putin's position was further entrenched, as I pointed out earlier, was that as he came into the prime minister position, is it the prime minister position or the presidency? I
I
can't.
think I think like the I think the head of state in Russia is the presidency, and then the one below it is prime minister. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure the prime minister is the step below presidency.
I think you're right. I think you're right. So as Putin comes into the presidency, that's when things go boom in Moscow. And it's sort of supposedly notoriously known by an older Russian generation that was a false flag operation of some sort, with the involved connivance of a mixture of Russian security services, probably primarily the FSB, which is the emanation of really the core of the KGB, which is about state security. Now, people will call it like it's the FBI, but we don't actually have an apparatus in the United States in terms of the security state that actually is similar to what the core of the KGB and now what the FSB is, and what the Chinese also have, which is the idea of a state security apparatus itself. So I think the FSB, this is obviously where Putin comes from. He was the head of FSB after it came out of KGB briefly, but also with elements from GRU, Russian military intelligence, who might have deeper relationships with certain assets within for example, the Chechen Muslim community. So they would have the relationship with people who could be framed as the patsies of the operation. But as sort of Putin comes into the presidency, the second Chechen war is getting going here. And then boom go the Moscow apartment buildings, hundreds of civilian Russians are dead. It's blamed fully on Chechen Muslim terrorists. And part of what Putin does is further entrench his domestic police state powers that ultimately then I think express themselves about how he and his network can control politics that would include journalism, whistleblowers going forward. And then, of course, the other thing that Putin does is he then uses the Moscow bombings to escalate the Second Chechen War to where I think we see like Grozny, the way that the Russians destroyed Grozny as a sort of an echo or previous echo of the model for what the Israelis are doing to Gaza to some extent.
Yeah, you can see pictures of Grozny from back then. Like it looks like it's something like reminiscent of like maybe like Dresden out of World War II, if not worse. And you mentioned journalism as well, and of course we have the infamous example of Anna Politkovskaya, who was a Russian journalist reporting on the war in Chechnya, and of course, from my understanding, she was assassinated on Putin's birthday of all things. Now,
but wait a minute. But that's a very interesting point. I always forget that is true. And so it seems like Putin seems to always get these birthday gifts that he can then deny any hand in. And October 7th, the attacks are also Putin's birthday gift too, as I previously pointed out, was expressed by Hamas leadership on Arabic-speaking TV after the fact that the Kremlin was very happy with the birthday gift that I think Netanyahu's regime, in combination with Hamas, gave Putin on his birthday of October 7th, similarly to potential, assassinations of journalists. And by the way, Politskaya, is that her name? Politskaya?
Politkovskaya, I believe.
Politkovskaya. She was actually crucial. She not only reported on the war in Chechnya and all that, but she was also appeared to be a key diplomatic asset at some point in relationship to incidents that, looking back, begin to look like other elements of staged statecraft from the Russian side of things. So I think that she was someone who was not just a journalist thorn in their side, but was also someone who was actually operating against their interests to be able to resolve certain political things politically at the highest levels of politics, rather than a level down in terms of massive total war. And I think there's a very strange parallel in terms of Israel's approach to Palestine, and especially Gaza, is that the biggest threat to the Israeli regime's plans for sort of finishing the first Nakba to all of this is that they are most scared of actually having a political conversation, of actually having political opposition, or political representatives of the Palestinian people that they can actually have to sit down at the table with and actually figure out what's to be done. So that's my instinct here, is that this is a sign of some kind of authoritarian kind of operation that will, as often as it can, move to total war to transcend politics in order to avoid political solutions. And that's one of the reasons why specific kinds of journalists are even deeper threats to Putin and his network than just their thorn in the side journalism.
Now, it's been claimed that Israel has stolen U.S. technology and sold it to Russia and China. I remember seeing like some videos like about this, like of a gentleman, I forget his name, where he's like said like that Israel has sold U.S. technology to China. I also looked up prior to this interview that an Israeli, like I guess, was arrested for selling U.S. tech to China, and United 24 media, like as I guess, reported on some Israeli firm or manufacturer, like I guess indirectly selling selling U.S. technology, or at least other kinds of technology to China, like through like various like middlemen. So like I guess Israel sells U.S. tech to one country, then that country sells it to Russia. So mean, why would they do this, in your opinion? And what, to your knowledge, do you know what they have stolen specifically, and what have they sold?
This is a very interesting question, and it's some of it is difficult to decipher in terms of the specifics, at least in terms of Russia and Israel. But a good framework for understanding this is something like the Jonathan Pollard affair, because what Jonathan Pollard stole from, basically Jonathan Pollard was seen as maybe the big, largest scale penetration of the high levels of U.S. Security, at the very least in the 80s, if not sort of, for the last quarter century of the 20th century. But he basically stole an entire room full of documents that were supposedly only really of interest to the Israelis, and it's things that the Israelis felt were the Americans were holding back from them. But what it appears is that there was actually a backdoor conduit of a lot of this information to the Soviets at the time. All right. And so this also then parallels with the what Robert Maxwell was doing. Robert Maxwell was, is seen as Israel's super spy. He helped place Israeli backdoored promise software into the heart of the U.S. nuclear establishment, which actually plays in a very interesting way, maybe 20 years later, in terms of a Israeli and Chinese operation combined against these same U.S. nuclear establishments. But Maxwell was not just a high-level industrial espionage type for Israel. He was also directly working with the highest levels of KGB. And what we know from the background there is that Maxwell was basically working with the highest levels of KGB to do things like trade-off, where if he helped them with certain operations, then they would then, and the quote is, expel the Jews, expel Russian Jews, and obviously thinking that, the large majority of them would be expelled to Israel, right? And so some of these trade-offs appear to be long-standing to some extent. So there's this really strong backdoor relationship between Russia and Israel that goes both ways. And so it does obviously relate to technology, to military hardware, to high technology, where Israel has become probably the single most crucial industrial espionage penetration agent in the world, especially in terms of Silicon Valley and the United States. But there's also this level where it operates at an maybe even higher level, a meta technological level, at the geostrategy above, that sits above espionage, that I think we can see in terms of the background of the Pollard affair and Robert Maxwell's operations. Because I'll also then say that what you can see is, okay, if the Soviets are expelling the Jews to Israel as part of the quid pro quo with Robert Maxwell, in that case as Israel's super spy, what then also are the Russians getting? We now know from someone like Craig Unger's book, American Compromat, and one of his sources, former KGB officer Yuri Shvets, who did also operate in the American sphere during the Cold War, that Shvets basically says that as Jews were leaving, whether they were expelled or they were voluntarily leaving the Soviet sphere, on the way out, 90% of them would be compromised in some way, or would have some kind of compromat hung over their head, so that they could be called on down the road in what I've now called Soviet psionim, sort of a parallel to the way that Israeli human intelligence, Mossad, runs their very small officer corps, where they then have at least 100,000, maybe a few 100,000 Jewish psionim who are down for the cause of Zionism in Israel around the world, that they can then call on to use as assets to help them, whether for medical medical operations or safe houses or financial operations all around the world. So in this case, you have the potential that the Soviets are then, and then eventually now the Russians are getting their Jewish sort of, emigres sort of largely pushed into the Israel, but also into other, to the West, into the United States, that those are there then remain Soviet Zionim in place that can be called upon. So what you then go look at is that it's not just that like the Israelis have passed certain kinds of technology specifically to the Russians. It's very likely the fact that there are actually Russian agents on the ground in Israel who are not only working on American technology, like fighter planes and stuff like that, but they're also some of the ones who are creating the Israeli technology companies. And I can't remember which company, but it was one of the key post 9/11 bulk collection companies. It might have been Narus, actually, which was tasked by NSA to help bulk collect American communications after September 11th. It's an Israeli military intelligence corporate front company. But the guy who started it was, went to a Soviet school in computer science or electrical engineering. And so I imagine that these kinds of things where the Soviet Zionim, the former Soviet Zionim, are riddling the Israeli high technology, military intelligence sectors, so that there's a ton of both hardware itself being passed out the back door via direct penetration by Russian intelligence at the highest levels of Israel. And then I'll also just sort of finish by talking a bit about China too, because it's often forgotten that Jonathan Pollard, at that time, he had a wife. I think her name was Ann Henderson. I think it was his wife. And at the very same time that Pollard was being arrested for spying for Israel, she was under investigation for working with China. And they were both being managed out of the same very Israeli kind of sector in the United States. And so the conduit goes both ways in many ways, so that Israel not only helps supply intelligence, military know-how, hardware to the Eastern Sphere and China and Russia, but it goes back the other way to Israel. So for example, the what was it called? There was an American spy plane. I think it was a Navy spy plane that was captured by the Chinese. I think in spring 2001 or something like that. I forget it's ES something. I forget what it's called.
Yeah, let me look it up real quick. Let me see. Let's see. U.S. spy plane captured by China. The EP-3.
The EP-3. And it's very interesting because that you now have James Bamford's book called Spy Fail, which goes back over a lot of the breakdown of U.S. counterintelligence over the years, with a very strong emphasis on Israel. And he unpacks a lot of the deeper background of someone like Arnon Milchan, who's a crucial, Israeli military intelligence agent while also operating as this billionaire producer in Hollywood. But Bamford goes over this history and totally neglects a fact that was brought up, 20 years earlier by Gordon Thomas in his book, Seeds of Fire, where Gordon Thomas basically says that the Israelis were brought in to be able to look over the American spy plane by the Chinese. All right. And so this is a crucial piece too, in that this is how some of this covert relationship exists over the years. And I'll just finish up by saying that the Seeds of Fire, this book, is a crucial journalistic telling of especially like the 90s into the early 2000s. And it's the only place that I've seen any reporting about this spring 2000. So the immediate year before this American spy plane is captured by the Chinese, it becomes a political crisis of some sort. Gordon Thomas basically says that the Chinese let the Israelis a team come in and actually dissect the plane. But a year earlier, the Chinese and the Israeli, Gordon Thomas said, had worked together on a combined, cyber and human intelligence operation to target Los Alamos, and were apparently successful. And so what did the Israelis in this case help the Chinese gather was the very core of U.S. nuclear security data, which was out of the Department of Energy's NEST, the Nuclear Emergency Security Team or something like that, that are basically responsible for maintaining the security of U.S. nuclear weapons, but also potential undoing of rogue nuclear devices that have been planted by terrorists, which is what the NEST was doing on September 11th. They were out of the country for the first time in 3 years in Europe doing a drill of undoing a nuclear device. And it appears from Seeds of Fire and Gordon Thomas's reporting that the Israelis helped the Chinese penetrate the Los Alamos nuclear laboratory and gain access to these really most serious of secret drives that the NEST team maintained that probably went over all of the entire architecture of the American nuclear weapon supply, how nukes are undone, how they're repurposed, all of these kinds of things. So I think that's a very good example of the role that Israel plays in supplying the highest levels of American military secrets and potentially technology to Russia and China.
Now, it's been claimed by some in alternative media, like Ryan Dawson, I think is one prominent example, that Putin kicked out or removed from power Jewish oligarchs in Russia. From your own research, what is the truth of the matter?
Once again, it's partially true. It's sort of classic alternative media, limited hangout with a muddying of the waters. And yes, so Putin comes in, and he actually, with the help of some of his Siloviki backers, he actually turns the table on a key Jewish Russian oligarch Berezovsky, who had actually been part of his rise originally. And so Putin does turn Berezovsky, turns him out, basically drives him out. Others are arrested. Certain Jewish Russian oligarchs are arrested. From my investigation and my investigations with Greg McCarran from The Antidote, we basically have found that the set of Russian Jewish oligarchs that Putin targeted in different ways, sometimes legally, sometimes covertly, sometimes violently, potentially, that they were actually maybe would have been seen as more of like what in the West would be called the George Soros group of oligarchs. And I'll just point out, George Soros, no matter all of the major problems in terms of what he has done and backed and stuff like that, George Soros was probably the only American Jewish billionaire that I know of who was publicly against the Iraq War, for example. And so a group of these Jewish Russian oligarchs actually appeared to have been some of those who were against the escalation of the Second Chechen War, for example. Okay. So it is the case that as Putin came in and especially solidified his operational power, especially after the Moscow apartment bombings, that he did discipline. He jailed and he expelled certain Russian Jewish oligarchs. Others sort of were stayed, and basically he just sort of what I said before, he basically put the Russian deep state back on its feet and let them know that they were operating underneath his and the Silovikis' power to some extent. But then the other thing that you see is that the nature of the actual relationship of Putin's Russia to the Russian Jewish community, the organized Russian Jewish community, has gone from looking more like some of the diversity of the American Jewish community, where it's very divided up in terms of what kinds of Jewish religious establishments and cultural institutions that Jews of different backgrounds go to, that after Putin comes in, Putin basically establishes a new Jewish commanding religious and cultural and economic power heights, where it's almost totally in the hands of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, up above 90%. And so many of the Jewish Russian billionaires now are involved and are of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and that many of these other Jewish Russian oligarchs were more of a sort of like a federation type or different approaches to the Jewish community, and they basically been pushed out or put under the power of the Putin-Siloviki Chabad Lubavitch relationship.
Do any Russian Jews hold influence in Israel and also with its relationship with to Russia?
Very much so, actually. And this is probably the biggest thing that actually changed or escalated after the Cold War was said to be over, was that certain Russian Jewish oligarchs have now become the wealthiest Israelis. People like Roman Abramovich, for example, who was identified by Catherine Belton in her book, Putin's People, as Putin's purse, really. And Abramovich, for example, also appears to be the crucial seed funder of the escalation of the ethnic cleansing operations in the West Bank, done under sort of religious anthropology, archaeology kinds of trips and organizations that then organized to actually, cement the Judaification of the West Bank over time. So these are not little players. They're not just parking their money, or they're not just using Israeli citizenship to protect themselves. They're also very involved in pushing certain kinds of policies that I would say also display that there is no actual pushback from Putin, for example, or Russia against the attempt by the Israelis over time to create the Greater Israel and to Judaicize the West Bank, and then probably with their intent now in Gaza, even though they deny it. So there's those types. Another crucial individual who answered to certain Russian organized crime figures and oligarchs was Natan Sharansky, who came in at the end of the Cold War and then was exposed by Robert Friedman in his book Red Mafia, that immediately after coming into Israel, Natan Sharansky was accepting all of this Russian organized crime money and spreading it out for political influence, including in a certain kind of relationship with Netanyahu's Likud people, it looks like. And Sharansky, it can be seen, I think, as an emissary of certain Soviet sphere oligarchs, even though to this day he's publicly sounds like he resists Russia and Putin influence. He was actually fingered as a Soviet police agent by Jewish refuseniks in Israel, including people with standing, such as an acclaimed Israeli surgeon, Yuli Nudelman, I think his name was, and wrote a whole book about Sharansky en masse. And he had testimony from Jews who'd actually been in some of the Soviet prisons before they left to Israel, and a lot of them had seen Sharansky not ever in the actual prison camp, but hanging out at the guard shack to some extent. So people like Sharansky, I think, can be seen as the underling political operatives for the rise of Russian political and economic interest in Israel. And so there's other characters. There's people like Lev Leviev, who's deep in the diamonds game, crucial player in terms of the Manhattan real estate sphere, direct tie-ins to Trump and Kushner. And there's a bunch of Russian Jewish oligarchs who now have Israeli citizenship and appear to not only be economic players but also political players.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier about like Putin like telling Iran of of how he has millions of Russian citizens living in Israel, and of course you also just mentioned of how Russian oligarchs have citizenship in Israel. To your knowledge, has Israel used its influence in the U.S. to maybe downplay Russia's actions in Ukraine or elsewhere, or maybe vice versa?
That's a good question. I think it looks like it, and it's maybe more that Israel will deploy its influence in the United States specifically in relationship to Russia in ways that appear to directly benefit themselves, I think. But what we've seen is that you would think that if Israel were actually, the commanding heights of the global Jewish community, a recognized self-described Jewish state, that they would have been, if it were actually about, sort of Jewish solidarity, let's say, that they would have immediately thrown in with the, Jewish leader of Ukraine, Zelensky. And basically the exact opposite happened. And that Netanyahu maintained his relationship with Putin even more, directly, it looks like, than he was willing to entertain Zelensky. And the Israelis throughout the Russian invasion of Ukraine have been very tepid in terms of even doing any basic amount of even defensive support for Ukraine. So that definitely the Israelis have decided to, for their geopolitical interests, they've decided ultimately to not, at the very least, to not rock the boat with their American partner, let's say, in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war. So there's that. But at the same time, like what we also see is, remember how I said that the Hamas leadership basically said that the Kremlin welcomed October 7th, and obviously what was going to be done afterwards in terms of putting another thing on the West plate, distracting the Western eyes from Ukraine to the Middle East. All of that happened. And then we see the Syrian government changed. And immediately we see Netanyahu taking advantage of the moment to bomb Syria harder and closer to the commanding heights of Syria in terms of Damascus than he ever did during the 10-year clean break destabilization civil war during Assad. And one of the things that we heard from the Israelis, this is an area where the Israelis did decide to lobby the Americans in relationship to Russia, is the Israelis called for the Americans to help bring Russia further back into Syria after the change of government, in order to soften up Syria. The new Syrian government is the way that they talked about it. So there is this very deep linkage, I think, between what goes on in terms of Israel's surroundings and then Russia's surroundings in Ukraine, and that the geopolitics of all of that are way more tied together. And although I don't know for sure the architecture, the strategic architecture reasoning behind, for example, October 7th, and the whole genocidal complex deployed after that, there is a strong feeling that I have that part of it not only takes Western and American eyes off of Ukraine, but it also seems to soften the moral judgment against what Putin's doing in Ukraine, and being like, well, at least it's Ukraine's not being treated like Gaza. At least the death of women and children are not at the levels in Ukraine as they are in Gaza or something like that. And so there's this much deeper kind of relationship of certain back scratching between Russia and Israel that goes on beyond overt lobbying on behalf of Russian interests by Israel and the United States.
Hmm. Now, going back to the issue of Russia, how would you characterize Russia's relationship with Ukraine prior to the invasions, of both 2014 and 2022?
To me, it looks like that the part of, at least with the rise of Vladimir Putin and the Siloviki, that there is not only a Russian revanchist kind of desire, but there is a larger a Russian imperial uh, strategy that is very soon after the end of the Cold War is beginning to be rolled out in terms of the former Soviet republics, basically, right? And that exists in Ukraine. And so to me, it looks like that the Siloviki, Putin's government and the Siloviki desired to keep Ukraine under Russian political control in the post-Cold War era. And that worked for a long time, and that or at least it worked for a decade or something like that, maybe a decade and a half. And that the Ukrainian leadership was largely riddled by Soviet apparatchiks and oligarchs who had a direct relationship from their upbringing, basically, to the Soviet architecture. And then you have 2004, and that's where things begin to get a little bit uncomfortable, I think, for the Russian sphere. And that's when you have the Orange Revolution. It's called the Orange Revolution, right? And you have the face-off between Yushchenko and Yanukovych, and Yushchenko appears to be, obviously there's pre-existing corruption that is on the ground in Ukraine, and a lot of it is related to its prior Soviet architecture to some extent, and it's also then related to what was done in Russia in terms of the Harvard boys and the attempted sort of neoliberal looting and pillaging kind of access to money and markets and resources and all of that was going on. But there looks like there was a real democratic, small d democratic desire in amongst the Ukrainian body politic to make its way as more of a European style country, and not to be an aggressor against Russia or anything like that, but to seek its own pathway post-Soviet Union. And someone like Yushchenko represented certain interests that promised to the Ukrainian people that there would be more of an engagement and economic and political relationships with the European sphere. And Yanukovych obviously represented a candidate who represented the Eastern Ukrainian, the more sort of Russian, the ethnic Russian and Russian political interests. And Yushchenko ends up, it looks like Yanukovych tries to steal the election, his people. And there's a very strange tie-in here with people like Paul Manafort around that time. Paul Manafort bringing in other Americans from the Karl Rove sphere who appear to have helped actually steal the American 2004 elections, operating out of Ohio. People like Mike Connell, who is known as Rove's IT guru, who looks like set up the cyber architecture for the Ohio part of the 2004 election to be stolen on behalf of Bush. And Manafort brings some of this network into the Ukrainian sphere on behalf of the Yanukovych side of things. And now then people from the alternative media, like left alternative media, like Aaron Mate, will say that Manafort was just operating on behalf of American and European imperial interests and only trying to service all of that. But the proof is in the pudding in terms of what actually happened, and that it was clear the Kremlin supported Yanukovych. After Yanukovych was caught stealing the elections, they ran it again, and Yushchenko wins. But then Yushchenko is also apparently poisoned, and the Russian sphere says, well, he maybe ate a bad oyster or something like that. But it was pretty clear that Yushchenko had been poisoned by likely some derivative of dioxin related to Agent Orange. And so in my mind, I see a lot of sort of dark poetry emanating out of the sort of KGB types, out of the Kremlin, and that they're sort of playing on the idea of the Orange Revolution and Agent Orange, the American use of Agent Orange dioxins in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and all of that. And the Russian sphere clearly tries to cover up what looks to have been a Russian originated poisoning of Yushchenko by hiring PR firms from France to then sort of take over some of the doctors who are attending to Yushchenko and all of that. And so a lot of this begins to get a little bit more disruptive in 2004 when it becomes clear that the Russians are beginning to lose political control over Ukraine. And then you have the decade then that leads up to 2014 and the Maidan revolt that once again is addressing Yanukovych's apparent last-minute attempt to avoid doing what he said he would do in terms of the European-Ukrainian relations. And, Yanukovych ultimately flees to Russia. So people will say, well, he's a Western asset and all of that. He's obviously some kind of Russian asset. They took him in after he got into trouble. And basically the Russians then seize that moment to create something that looks very similar to me to the Syrian clean break civil war, where there was an architecture of the creating a dirty war in the Donbass, and you see people like Alexander Dugin and his Russian Orthodox Christian billionaire patron Malofeev directly operating in that region and helping facilitate basically the rise of Russian politics in the Donbass. And then also, to me, it looks like they're actually orchestrating a longer term dirty war, a sort of masked as a civil war that can then be used to claim to be the impetus for the reason for what is then called a special military operation and just a Russian intervention to save Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. But my sense is that all of this is really much longer orchestrated in terms of Russian desired political control, if not full geographic control. Now, I get the sense that it's similar to Israel in a certain way. People talk about Greater Israel. There's two parts of Greater Israel. One part of Greater Israel is just like the immediate sort of areas of what was seen as original Israel in terms of reclaiming full geographical command of Gaza and the West Bank, parts obviously little slivers of Syria, maybe Jordan, a little bit of Egypt, but it's not some kind of expansive thing, between the Tigris and the Euphrates or something like that. It's not that kind of thing. It's actually more of, there's a more covert part of Greater Israel where it's about establishing Israeli hegemony, political hegemony in the region that then lines up with what the actual nature of things like the Abraham Accords were. So I think that the Russians are pursuing a greater Russia kind of strategy in relationship to Ukraine, where yes, they want to maintain physical, geographical control over parts of what they would call former Ukraine. But what they really want is full geopolitical hegemony over the entirety of Ukraine under the guise of what they'll call political neutrality and anti-NATO, or sort of keeping NATO out and all of that. Now, I'm not saying that there are no legitimate reasons that Russia would be nervous about further NATO involvement in a country right on their border, like in Ukraine. That's obviously, true. Like the United States, we got very nervous when Soviet nukes were deployed in Cuba. However, we did not do a full-scale invasion of Cuba, even though, I'm sure there were people who wanted to do that kind of thing, and all of that. And so I guess I'm just saying is that to me, what it looks like, the actual relationship of Russia and Ukraine is between a revanchist former empire that seeks to reestablish its geopolitical hegemony in its region, and a former, Soviet state that seeks to have its own sovereignty, political independence of some sort, and does not want to, create some kind of long-term hostility with Russia, but also does not want to be managed by Russia and wants to have a stronger relationship with the European sphere, which it feels politically maybe more at home in.
Mm. Now, touching upon NATO, you brought up the example of the U.S. and Cuba. I guess similarly, it's been repeatedly claimed that Russia invaded Ukraine because of NATO expansionism. That that Ukraine was about to join NATO or was seeking to join NATO. I've seen even critics like Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky have said that that's actually not the case. But what would be the truth of the matter, from what you've seen
about NATO specifically and Ukraine?
Yeah, that Russia invaded Ukraine because of NATO expansionism. What would be the actual truth of the matter?
Yeah, I think it's what I had formerly just said, that it was a pretext, that the whole conversation about NATO expansion was largely used as a pretext by the Russians to justify their ongoing political invasion of Ukraine that had started years, if not a couple decades earlier, actually, in many ways, and that it was just the moment where it was chosen to go hot, and actually have Russian tanks fully on the ground there. Now, I'm not saying that there is not certain elements from the American and NATO side that did not seek to potentially antagonize or to roll back Russian influence at the very least in terms of the expansion of the NATO sphere. But a lot of the reason for the expansion of NATO was not because of the pushing of the United States, but it was because of the prior experience of certain European countries in relationship to having been occupied by the Soviets, and seeing what that was like, and seeing that there was this fairly aggressive, at the very least, undertone in the resurgent and apparently revanchist, sort of neo-feudal or neo-imperial kind of model under Putin and his Siloviki that they were concerned about. And people can understand that, I think, if they're willing to be honest about the massive involvement of Russian political warfare operations in almost the entirety of the European political sphere. And so with the Europeans who are in the know, and maybe some of them at the commanding heights of foreign policy and their state apparatus, they saw what happened in Ukraine, and that the Russian precursor to actual physical kinetic warfare is political warfare of many different means, and all of Europe has seen this kind of political encroachment by the Russians in terms of their domestic politics. everywhere from the role of Russian intelligence in aspects of Brexit in the UK, to the questions of the relationship of the AfD in Germany to Russian networks, to Romania, to aspects in France and Spain, and and in Italy. It's very extensive and intensive. And I'll just finish up by pointing out too that the Europe becomes a key battleground that shows the actual geopolitical confluence of interests between Russia and Israel. And Greg McCarran and I, caught Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador, talking about how basically Europe needed to be rolled back because of how critical the European masses and certain European leadership had become of Israeli operations, and the rising calls for things like boycott, divestment, sanctions, where we're now seeing a pretty severe pitch of that. For example, in Norway, the largest labor union that is basically the sort of umbrella for all of the labor unions in Norway, just maybe a month or two ago, they decided to divest themselves fully from Israeli companies. And now the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is trillions of dollars of a lot of oil wealth that Norway has very wisely invested in its own sovereignty and its own people over the long period of time, that they've decided to divest fully from Israeli companies. So this has gone from being, people, activists on the streets or things like that calling for boycott, divestment, sanction, to trillions of dollars of, European sovereign wealth funds basically taking the next step here. And so obviously Israel will be very interested in rolling that back, destabilizing certain parts of European political sovereignty that might intersect with these kinds of calls and movements and all of that. And then the Russians obviously have their interests in rolling back any kind of European sovereignty, especially if it were in relationship to what they might call the Atlanticists or the Anglo-Americans and all of that. And so there is a long-standing, and I would say sort of becoming more clear, geopolitical confluence and of interest and a relationship between Russian and Israeli. Almost you could see a pincher move against European sovereign politics.
I'm glad you mentioned earlier, like, of how you mentioned of how, like, you're not saying like that there may not be like any people within the U.S. or Europe who may not want to try to antagonize Russia. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I imagine some critics who may watch this might think like, oh, like you and I or others who might share a similar view are just like anti-Russian or want the war to continue. I mean, I don't know if you've ever encountered anything like that before.
Yes, and this is the cynical part. I think there is a cynical major faction within the American establishment and policy elite that did see this, that from their view, as a proxy war where they could utilize the Ukrainians as a way to push back or even bleed the Russians. So there is that aspect, and it's a very dirty aspect, I think. And I've been clear about that. I'm against them too. But it's similar to that. I actually have an activist background as an actual pro-peace, anti-war activist. And this is why I was very against the Iraq War when my country did it, and I would be very against an American invasion of, a country in Central or South America because of growing Chinese or Russian influence. I think that these are political matters that should be handled politically, which I believe is the highest level. Obviously, the highest level of politics is politics. And a lot of that comes out of, political movements and understanding and all of that. So you're not going to find in me any justification for American imperial interests or American war making, except for if it's actually defensive. And, I was definitely not in my lifetime. And, I think almost never is it really actually American war making defensive. And I would also point out that if I were, let's say I were a Russian, I'm a Jewish American patriot of conscience. That's my bias. That's my political bias. And if I were a Russian, let's say, a Russian patriot, I would understand, I think, in a similar kind of way that I understand that war provocations have only really actually weakened and hurt my country, the United States of America, at least in my lifetime. The fallout of the war on terror and the Iraq War, both in terms of physical carnage abroad and at home, but also the economics and the politics and the rise of, multi-trillion-dollar so-called domestic security architectures that are now being rolled out on the streets of America under the expansion of DHS and ICE and masked men unidentified and backed by, hundreds of billions of dollars, really, and often foreign technology like Israeli cyber technology and spy technology and all of that, that this is, weakened our place at home and abroad. And so part of the way that I would speak out if I were an actual Russian patriot, let's say, if I were a Russian and I were an actual Russian patriot, or let's say I were actually someone like a Ryan Dawson, who, says he understands the Russian perspective in all of this against the Zio-American imperial elite or something like that, then I would just point out that these kinds of aggressive military operations, although they may expand your regional influence and sort of burnish your military industrial or your defense industrial base over the short to mid term, over the longer term, I think it's very obvious that you actually destroy your own society as well as the societies that you actually go and physically attack and bomb. So that's my sense of it. So rather than sort of having some kind of, anti-Russia or Russophobic kind of perspective on all of this, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about from what I would hope would be an enlightened self-interest in terms of the American perspective of actual sort of American dissidents such as myself, from seeing exactly what has gone down in terms of my own country, in certain ways being baited, let's say. There was some kind of baiting going on in terms of the war on terror, September 11th. And I would say even those American imperial neocons, they'll call the paleo neocons, those that actually sought to use the war on terror moment to expand the influence of the American state and military around the world, that they ultimately have been shown to have been useful idiots, useful dupes for a multipolar Russian, Chinese, Israeli axis in terms of the Iraq War actually being one of the worst things in the eyes of the world and of the American people, in terms of that the American government has done, especially in terms of the 21st century. It is ruined a lot of any kind of potential moral standing that we might have had post-Cold War. And that's why I thought it was a big deal that I caught Alexander Dugin at the New Horizons conference, a little bit more than a half decade ago, talking about 9/11 to a group of American dissidents who were proclaimed to be anti-war and pro 9/11 truth, very often dissidents, and Dugin proclaiming to them in Iran, with obvious some kind of Russian influence and interest in the matter, that September 11th and then what was done afterwards really represented the end of Russian decline and the rise of the multipolar New World Order. And so under that kind of understanding, I would just reject any and all kinds of the combination of deception and aggressive warfare as good for anyone, let alone humanity.
I honestly wish there was more people had your kind of consistency on that, because I mean, for me personally, like I mean, I served in the Marines. I never deployed or saw combat, but still, like, I love my country, but I do not love, like, my country's foreign policies. I do not love the fact that we have an empire, or that we pursued empire. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that I think that Russia's empire is good, or nor do I think that Israel's attempts to become an empire are good either. I'd rather that we just have, and ideally we would have in a peaceful world, but of course we don't live in an ideal world, unfortunately. Now, it's been commonly claimed that the Euromaidan was a U.S. instigated coup against Viktor Yanukovych. And of course, we have the leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland that's used as evidence of this. But from what I've seen, some people have varying interpretations of that. Some people say that it's proof that the U.S. Used the Maidan as an attempt at a coup, and others say that it needs to be looked at differently. What is your perspective on the matter?
I actually see it similarly to the way that I see the origins of the Syrian civil war to some extent, and that there were obvious pre-existing small d democratic forces that were interested in either a replacement or a massive reformation of their governments, and that early on those were then escalated and destabilized to some extent, for example, by snipers shooting at both sides. Right. I actually think you see this happen in both in Syria in the very beginning, and then also then in Ukraine surrounding Maidan. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not. I'm not saying also that those were, American interests that were doing that. I actually don't think that's the case. I actually think that if there were some kind of external forces that might have been interested in that, I would think there would actually be Israel in the case of Syria, and I actually think it would be Russia in the case of Ukraine, in terms of the pursuing what we might call clean break doctrines in terms of destabilization campaigns. Now, obviously, there was American involvement in Ukraine, especially in terms of the supporting aspects of the civil society. Now, we all know that things like National, Endowment for Democracies and aspects of USAID, which operate at the level of, civilian support systems and institutional guidance and, those kinds of things that are also obviously can also serve as fronts for U.S. intelligence. And that's part of their reason for being. It's not their entire reason for being, though, obviously, because, the United States does have interest in pursuing what might be called open and free societies in relationship to our own interests to some extent. So there was that American involvement there, and there was American both individual and institutional engagement in the institutions and on the ground in Ukraine. But I think it's a totally not only overblown, but I think it's a canard to basically say that, to deny that there was an actually strong Ukrainian organic small d democratic desire to reform their government that then turns into an overthrow of some sort after the thing gets notched up by, at the very least, who would have the power to be able to shoot at both Yanukovych forces and protest forces. Obviously, elements of the Yanukovych regime would have those kinds of assets in place to be able to do that, to basically say, look, these are violent protesters and they want to seek to kill us and all of that kind of thing. So I guess my shorthand understanding is, yes, Victoria Nuland passed out sandwiches on the ground. Yes, Victoria Nuland said, F the EU. But from what I've read about it is that all of this has been, especially the phone call, the Russian intercepted phone call of Victoria Nuland, that's been totally overblown by very Russian sphere information networks to basically try to imply that this was a totally CIA or Pentagon or State Department run sort of pseudo coup by the American sphere, and it does not look like that to me. Even though there was some involvement, and obviously there were American interests that sought, a resolution that would be more in American interest than in Russian interests. But I guess my main point is that the Ukrainians, similarly to this Syrian civil society, had its own background, its own experience on the ground, and in terms of certain corruption and or authoritarian interests, sometimes aspects of foreign interests, that their own background with that was created incentive on their own to desire to resolve these kinds of situations in a political fashion. And then a lot of that then gets used to create some kind of violent scenario. And it's obviously out of the wake of the Maidan becoming a violent, seen as a violent overthrow, even though it wasn't actually like, it didn't really like violently overthrow. It just, it was clear that Yanukovych was not going to survive. And then he fled to Russia. And then immediately in the wake of that is when you see the escalation of the Russian dirty war architecture in Eastern Ukraine and the Donbass.
I think, was it, if I recall, I think just a moment ago, you alluded to like the issue of like violence, like both in Ukraine and Syria. Like, have you seen claims that, I guess during that infamous like sniper massacre or police massacre, whatever you want to call it, during the Maidan, some have claimed that it was a false flag operation. Like, I think if I recall correctly, I think Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky, who I mentioned earlier, like, he's done like an extensive like report on it. Like, I guess he said like that sniper fire was mainly coming from Maidan controlled buildings. Like, I guess like the perpetrators, I guess, were far right groups or far right individuals. What would be your take on that?
It's something that I looked into a little bit years ago, but I haven't yet come to a firm understanding of exactly who did it and why. I have seen that there are those indicators that it could be, in the realm of right sector who were seeking to inflame the matter, which it becomes sort of interesting too when you think about the background of Kolomoisky, and Kolomoisky as as a key early proponent of the rise of Zelensky. But then after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the actual Ukrainian security state actually sort of goes after Kolomoisky. And Kolomoisky begins to be seen as having had some very strange relationship with the Azov battalion, and then ultimately says that he could go with the Russian sphere or the Ukrainian sphere. He could go either way in it. So I think there are questions that still need to be answered about. My suspicion is that there's these Russian network influences in relationship to the nature of that sniping and of the far right and the neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine that are then also used as the main pretext, the public pretext for the so-called legitimate operation, special military operation in Ukraine by the Russians. Denazification. Denazification is one of their three main pillars for their justification and their outcomes that they seek in Ukraine. So to me, it begins to look like we should really look at some of the basis of some of the aspects of especially sort of like neo-Nazi or right Nazi adjacent kind of groups in Ukraine. Obviously, because of Ukraine's position in World War II and between the Nazis and the Soviets, there is obviously a Nazi and a far right element in relationship that is then intersects with just sort of basic Ukrainian nationalism, that then becomes what's seen as ultra nationalism and all of that. But I have a sneaking suspicion that the sort of more extreme elements that are then used by the Russian sphere, especially in the West, in terms of alternative media, to point to Azov and right sector and all of that kind of stuff, that this should be potentially looked at in relationship to the idea of Russian counter gangs of some sort. And it's sort of similar to me in terms of the Israel Hamas relationship. And that one of the obviously, I think, unbelievable parts of this idea that all of Israeli security broke down on October 7th is the fact that there's, all kinds of penetration groups in Israeli intelligence, from Shin Bet, Shabak, to Israeli military intelligence, has whole units where they are seen to be of Palestinian or Arabic, descent, and they operate behind enemy lines. So obviously Mossad has actual sources in place in many ways too. So I think that in a similar kind of way, that to me, it's unbelievable that the Israeli security services could have just somehow not seen October 7th coming, after they had certain plans, after they had all kinds of people reporting on it, after they had obvious geospatial intelligence, after they had Unit 8200 signals intelligence intercepts. It's hard not to see the relationship of Netanyahu and his regime with Hamas as a relationship with some kind of beneficial counter gang to their interests. So I see some kind of parallel architecture in relationship to Putin's Kremlin and some of the Ukrainian elements that are then pointed to as a part of the major justification for the denazification operation in Ukraine.
Now, how would you characterize Viktor Yanukovych's presidency? During his presidency, was he largely a Russian puppet, were the policies he was enacting largely steering the country towards Russia or away from Europe and Western influence?
Well, it's interesting because I get this. I don't know tons of it. I haven't, it's sort of similar to my, lack of deep knowledge around Russian domestic politics. But my sense of it is that it's sort of similar in a certain way to Zelensky in a certain way, is that during a time of crisis, someone who may have been part of a sphere, for example, Zelensky was very part of a Russian media sphere. He comes to prominence in many ways in his, making media in relationship for the Russian sphere, for Russian speaking spheres and audiences, and all of that. But that during a time of either national security or a political crisis, then there are other elements of the society, in addition to the individual leader, that then begin to make choices about which direction they want to go in. And so I'm not sure whether Yanukovych was totally sort of just monolithically serving Russian interests throughout his years leading Ukraine. It could be that. It could be that. I don't know enough to say either way. However, when it came down to it, when there was crucial decisions and promises that he'd made to Ukrainian civil society in terms of their relationship with Europe economically, that would then lead to cultural and political relationships, he was at the very least pressed upon by his Russian, I don't know if they call them handlers or those who had influence over him, to pull the rug on it. And the fact that he was then offered, to flee to Russia, I think shows at the very least that he was considered a Russian asset, in a similar way that we can say that, Assad was then taken in, obviously, as some kind of Russian asset. Now, did that mean that everything that Assad did while he was in charge of Syria was on behalf of the Russians? No. Now, Ukraine is obviously closer to the Russian sphere. It's a former Soviet territory. So obviously, it would be more logical that a potential Russian asset in place right next door to them would be more intensely servicing Russian interests consistently over their time in power than someone in the Middle East. But I'm just pointing out that obviously Assad was seen as a Russian asset. He helped bring the Russians in to back him up during his civil war. And he was then returned the favor by being allowed to be protected, then to flee to Russia after he fell. And something very similar happened with Yanukovych. Now, the degree of it, I think, is different, partially because of what I talked about, their difference in geography and background and all of that. But I just think that there's enough facts on the open table to basically say that at the very least, both of these people, and Yanukovych especially, at some level, operated in a way where they were seen as Russian assets of some sort.
Now, as a follow-up to that, if I recall correctly, Yanukovych was coming from the Party of Regions, which I think, to my understanding, was mainly dominated by voters from the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. In your own personal opinion, do the people of Donbass maybe do have indeed some legitimate grievances with the Ukrainian government? I mean, especially probably after the Maidan and, of course, what's been going on now, since 2014, a separatist civil war.
Yes, I mean it's similar to the Syrians in a way that obviously that it's very interestingly parallel in many ways in terms of Syria is seen as this very multi-ethnic, multicultural society that has a long historical political history of being able to keep those different interests together to some extent. Now, maybe in a certain way, Ukraine is more like Iraq in terms of maybe the Shia-Sunni divide or something like that, with the Kurds or something like that. But obviously, Russian speakers, people in Eastern Ukraine who want to maintain their relationship with what they see as their home country, so Russian Ukrainians or something like that, they obviously have legitimate political interests in terms of being concerned about ultra-nationalist Ukrainian groups or politics that become Russophobic or anti-Russian. But I guess I would say that in a similar kind of way that the Jewish Zionist leadership, you saw the suffering and political, both physical and political suffering of Jews, especially in Europe during World War II, as an opportunity for their own politics, where you have someone like FDR's Jewish deputy going to American Jewish Zionist alleged leadership with a plan to use American leadership with an alliance of countries to help save, hundreds of thousands up to 1 million of European Jews from the European Shoah, growing Shoah at the time. And FDR and his Jewish representative were rejected as a traitor. The Jewish representative was rejected as a traitor by the Jewish Zionist American alleged leadership, because they said, well, if you actually save the Jews from Europe to places not Palestine, then how can we use them basically as what Thomas Suarez, who wrote State of Terror about the terrorist origins of Israel, calls facts on the ground in a way. So I sort of see a similar kind of a very cynical and dirty usage of, one's quote unquote own people between maybe I might say, especially the Jewish American Zionist alleged community leadership and the actual Jewish lives on the ground in Europe at the time, in a similar kind of way that the Russian leadership sees, quote unquote, their people in eastern Ukraine as people to take advantage of, as facts on the ground that they can use in relationship to the orchestration of their dirty war politics. And I mean, it's so obvious that this was the plan when you talk about the little green men and all of that kind of stuff, where it was then the Russians tried to put forth that this was totally an organic political uprising on the ground in the Donbass, and that everyone welcomed foreign Russian control, basically, while also saying, no, there were no Russian military and intelligence on the ground when everybody knows that there was. So it's a cynical kind of operation taking advantage of legitimate political and physical concerns by ethnic Russians, let's call them, in eastern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Hey, you mentioned like the issue of the little green men. Like, of course, like we have defectors like Igor Salakov, who, if I'm not mistaken, he was both a Wagner mercenary, but also I think for a time he worked for the Russian GRU intelligence. So he was there, of course, in Donbass, fighting with the pro-Russian separatists, and of course, he of course defected later on. So of course, that's just one little bit of proof of Russian intelligence or special forces operating in Donbass. And I would also add, like, of course, this is not to justify any crimes against civilians, but of course, a lot of Russians in Crimea and maybe I would assume maybe also Donbass are descendants of settlers, of people who were resettled by the Soviet Union, especially after the Holodomor or the Crimean the forced deportation of the Crimean Tatars. Of course, in my personal opinion, the Tatars should be able to have more of a say in their historic homeland, but I doubt Russia is going to allow that to happen.
That's I think that's a very good point you're making here, and I also appreciate you bringing in Strelkov, Igor Girkin. I think you're talking about, right, Igor Strelkov.
I'm not sure about, but I know the one that I'm referring to is Igor Salakov.
Salakov.
He's a Russian defector. I think he currently he's residing in the Netherlands at the moment. Like he did a deposition, or he wrote a statement like for some European court. I remember sending it to you like over on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, like of some German docu-series where they interviewed him.
Oh, right. I have to go back to that that you sent me, because I never looked all the way into that, because that's another piece of this that actually then aligns with what we've found out from like Igor Girkin, Strelkov, who was part of like the troika of, I think, of Dugin, Malofeev, and Girkin, who were very likely in the commanding heights of this operation that's being disclosed by this Russian dissident in the Netherlands, actually. And I think you're right also to bring in that there is very likely a deeper background here of ethnic cleansing, of Russian and formerly Soviet Russia, ethnic cleansing of some sort, and using populations as parts of geopolitical pawns on the chessboard. That does go back to things like Holodomor, and then also in terms of I believe there was an ethnic cleansing operation of some sort in Crimea under Stalin, and so I think you're right to sort of ask questions about is this really an organic setup in terms of the current ethno-national relationships in and between Eastern Ukraine and Russia, and then Ukraine, Kyiv and Eastern Ukraine, that there is you're sort of like raising questions in my mind about whether I haven't gone deep enough back in terms of the more geostrategic machinations of this very likely long-term setup in relationship to what's now become the kinetic Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would you say are probably Russia's primary goals with taking control of the Donbass in Ukraine? Like, from my understanding, like Donbass sits on a lot of natural resources and gas, and at the same time, Crimea, of course, has a major port, and from my understanding as well, there's been some discoveries that Crimea has a lot of offshore oil as well.
Yeah, I think it's the twin pillars of geopolitics, which is in one case resources, industrial, trading access, energy, minerals, all that kind of stuff. Then that's the visible, like in permaculture design, which I have a background in. You always talk about the visible sector and the invisible sector, and so the visible sector is all of those kinds of things that makes human civilization possible, global economics, all of that. And then there's the invisible sector, and I think that's the twin pillar of deep geopolitics is political power, geopolitical expression, influence, domination in certain cases. So I think that Russia is pursuing both of these at the same time, and I think it's very clear that the eastern Ukraine is crucial from the Russian perspective, including control over Crimea, because of access to resources and then access to trading and transport lines, especially in terms of the Black Sea. Now, and this is also then why I think we've seen an interesting growth of Russian and Turkish conflict, because Turkey is very likely the only other power in the Black Sea region that could actually has a large enough defense industrial base and economic base to actually be one who pushes back against the attempt by Russians to dominate that entire geopolitical sphere. So I do think that it is exactly as you said, that you add food to it and grain production. You see the way that was very early weaponized in terms of the invasion, and where it was not being supplied, Ukrainian grain was not being supplied to the Southern Hemisphere and North Africa and all of that was then utilized as a sort of a leverage point that the Russians had early on. So yeah, combining all of that kind of stuff, oil, shipping lanes, materials, food production, and then you combine it with in terms of geopolitical influence, especially into the European sphere, and I would say the Middle East sphere, because this is also then why Syria was so crucial to the Russians as a potential their key outpost, not only in the Middle East, but also it became, once the Russians were brought in by Assad into Syria during the Civil War, the Russian installations there became another key outpost in relationship to their Wagner operations, their resource operations in Africa, for example. So it became they're always, obviously every military power in the world is always thinking of forward bases, whether it's in terms of economic power or in terms of military power, and that's one of the major pieces that Russia has interest in. And I also think it's the reason why Russia is insistent, both by the Kremlin itself and their sort of mouthpieces like Dugin, for example, that they require physical control over the eastern Ukrainian territories that they currently occupy, and that they are not calling for full physical control over Ukraine, but I would say political control over Ukraine under the proxy of so-called neutrality, right? And that neutrality option that I think they want to maintain for the entirety of Ukraine, where they don't have actual military forces on the ground, is actually the key piece of their invisible sector desires in terms of influence in relationship to the European political sphere.
Since you mentioned neutrality, with this whole issue of like the recent meeting between Trump and Putin and Alaska, like of course people are speculating, whether we'll eventually maybe get a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, like within Trump's second term. If we somehow do get one, like I imagine it's probably going to be very, very fragile. Do you see like maybe after Trump leaves office, assuming if like after he leaves office, do you see like maybe Russia potentially trying to maybe reinvade or maybe even try to gain control over the entirety of Ukraine at some point?
Well, this is where it becomes complicated, I think. And I think there's a piece where Trump is coming up against the nature of the people who hold things over him to some extent, and one of these people that holds things over him is Putin and his Kremlin, and the deep background of their involvement with Trump over many decades, including in terms of washing probably hundreds of millions or maybe even potentially more than $1 billion through Trump properties, not only the United States, but in different parts of the world via the under half of the Russian deep state. So, yeah, and then also the obvious facts of the Russian involvement in the political warfare in the American political theater against the American body politic that at the very least help influence elections, if not to actually help manufacture this currently, I think, very internally conflicted and destabilized political environment. So I think like Trump actually thought that he could broker a peace, a so-called peace, that would please the Russian sphere and Putin enough that they would go for it. And this is partially why he did these, I think, sort of very like wild approaches to sort of totally cut the Ukrainians out of conversations originally in terms of beginning the so-called peace processes, because he thought that he could arrange something that Putin would go for, and that Putin also potentially really did want to stop the war. Now, I'm actually not sure. I think that my sense is Putin is in a difficult spot right now, and that he is gaining a lot by keeping the war going in terms of revitalizing the Russian industrial base. It is a key political organizing tool domestically to be a country at war. And he also, it's a way to keep these sort of potentially angry young men who've now been in the battlefield from coming home and expecting some kind of remuneration and sort of beginning to understand the dirtiness in which the war that they were deployed to has been using them by the commanding heights in Moscow. And so there's a lot of reasons why Putin does not want to stop the war, I think. And even if he were to get everything that he said that he wanted politically, potentially. And so I think that that's where Trump is bumping up against that now. He's like, I thought I sort of gave him everything that he wanted, and they're not taking it. And this is why they're now proposing to sort of skip over a ceasefire and try to just go to a so-called peace process. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, in terms of your question about whether Russia would reinvade potentially, I mean, a lot of that obviously depends on what are the Ukrainians willing to give up in order to gain what they'll call a peace, but is really just a ceasefire. And ceasefire really should be the logical next step here. This is why it was resisted so much also in terms of Israel and Gaza. Because ceasefire is the first step towards actually political negotiations, towards an actual peaceful resolution of some sort. So I think that there's the question of whether Russia would reinvade after a so-called peace plan or something like that, or a peace agreement that potentially skips over an actual ceasefire step, is a little bit complicated, and it depends on what they actually would get to keep in terms of from the Ukrainian side. But I would just go back to what I previously said, that my sense is that similarly to the Israelis, that the Israelis, I don't believe, actually desire to occupy Egypt or occupy, the bulk of Syria militarily, or have it on the ground, or occupy Saudi Arabia or Iraq or things like that. But they do seek to occupy all of the West Bank. They do seek to occupy in some way all of Gaza, the Golan Heights, maybe some part of the Sinai. And it's similar, I think, to what the Russians want. The Israelis seek political hegemony in their region via these kinds of economic and security relationships that have been put forth by the Abraham Accords. That Netanyahu himself basically said, this is a way of transcending the Palestinian question. We don't have to seek a solution with the Palestinians politically before we can make these kinds of quote unquote peace deals. Remember, it's a similar kind of thing. The Abraham Accords were called a Middle East peace deal. There was not war between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There was not war between the UAE and Israel, Morocco and Israel, all this, Sudan and Israel, all these kinds of, parts of the greater Abraham Accords, and yet they called it a peace deal. So something similar, I think, is being, manufactured and sold to us in relationship to this alleged Russian-Ukrainian peace deal. Including from the American role in all of it. And that what really, again, the Russians want is they want physical control over these key areas that you already talked about in terms of a Black Sea access, oil access, minerals, food production, industrial production, all of that. And then they want political oversight, let's say not control, but political oversight of the totality of Ukraine. And then it would all be under the guise of, whether the Russians would sign off on future Ukrainian leadership. And you remember, this was like one of the earliest things that seemed to be being pushed after Trump got back in, was this idea that Putin says Zelensky has to go. And then we saw the entire Russian alternative media sphere saying this guy's just stealing billions of dollars from the Americans. You had J.D. Vance and Trump sort of ridiculing Zelensky for his clothes in the Oval Office and all of that kind of stuff. So that was an attempt to fulfill, I think, the Russian desire for political oversight under the guise of neutrality in the totality of the commanding heights of Ukraine politically. So I think the question of whether they would reinvade, if there is actually an end to the current war, it would all be dependent upon whether the Russians agreed to the Ukrainian leadership and where Ukraine was actually going politically in terms of its own sovereign relationships.
As a follow-up to that, since you mentioned some of the ceasefires, it's been brought up in the media that that I guess apparently the U.S., the U.K., Boris Johnson, for instance, pressured Ukraine to reject, I guess, a ceasefire proposal that Russia brought up. I guess there was some Istanbul ceasefire proposal as well that Ukraine rejected. What are your own thoughts on that? I mean, if I recall correctly, some of the demands included that Ukraine demilitarize. I think that had to give up some land or something like that. I forget all the demands, but I mean, in your opinion, would it come as any surprise that Ukraine rejected any of these proposals, whether they were pressured or not?
No, and it's a very good question, and it's another area where I have not looked into deeply forensically in terms of what all was actually being proposed and agreed upon in terms of Istanbul, and then the actual specific role of Boris Johnson. But the way that it is being portrayed reminds me a lot of the way that Maidan and Victoria Nuland and the F the EU kind of stuff is being portrayed. That it's basically just being used by Russian sphere disinformationists to basically try to make it seem as if the Ukrainians want to give up all kinds of territory, and the Ukrainian streets would seek to give up their own potential, military security, sovereignty in order to end the war, or something like that. When it's obviously the case that the core of of the Ukrainian society does not want to hand over their security and their sovereignty to Russia. And so then this is all then pinned on the heads of the evil, West and Boris Johnson and all of that. And so that's just my suspicion, is that you're exactly correct, and that there's very likely all kinds of other reasons because of what the Russians were demanding in terms of even the beginning of these talks about a potential ceasefire and end to the so-called conflict, that they had all kinds of reasons of their own to reject it. And it's very likely, looking back, that the Russians put this in almost as poison pills in order to make sure that it would not happen going forward, because they had not actually yet fulfilled their political reasoning behind their so-called special military operation.
I've had the exact same suspicion that they gave all these demands that they likely knew Ukraine would not accept, as potentially as a pretext to them to continue the war, and then say, oh, see, Ukraine it doesn't want peace. Ukraine wants to reject peace, or the West wants to reject peace. Well, maybe it's a bit of both for all we know. Now,
Yeah.
wrapping up here, it's commonly brought up that there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and yes, I would agree, including in the Ukrainian military. We have the Azov Regiment, formerly the Azov Battalion, and the Azov movement at large. We have praising of and love for Stepan Bandera and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which we know was unfortunately they were indeed complicit in the Holocaust and in the murder of Jews and others. And of course, there's also the 14th SS Galicia Division. What is your personal take on this? About the whole issue of the far right and neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
I think it's just as you pointed out, and that it's similar to what I said before, that because of the geography of Ukraine in relationship to the conflict between the Nazis and the Soviets in World War II, that it's the same in relationship to the United States in terms of the Soviet Union, that it would obviously be seen as that the hyper nationalists or the ultra nationalist elements of the United States, when we're seen to be in a global, Cold War conflict with what is seen as a left wing, a communist kind of, great power of some sort, that of course that those kinds of elements are going to sort of come from and legitimately be legitimately seen as, far right reactionaries, neo-Nazi types, ultra-nationalists of all sorts. And so it's sort of similar in a certain way in terms of Ukraine. And I guess my sense is that I think this is being so cynically used by the Russian sphere in a similar kind of way that the the Soviets cynically used American civil rights conflicts and racial conflict in the United States, and certain kinds of organic movements to further perfect the Union, let's say, in an American context, to actually help inflame it and to utilize the real standing problems and problematic elements inside of the United States and amongst Americans to actually push their own, political destabilization active measures against what they called the main enemy. So, and I'm not sure that the United States has ever stopped being the main enemy from the core of the Russian security establishment in many ways. And so this then obviously plays out in a cynical fashion in terms of what then Russia sees also as a proxy war too, and will then utilize the nature of the sort of the far right, the ultra nationalist, the neo-Nazi aspects in some cases inside of Ukraine as a way to, once again, I'll point out, legitimize a key one of their three pillars for the special military operation, as they call it, denazification. And it's very similar to the rhetorical warfare that's used by the Israelis in terms of Palestine and Gaza specifically, especially Hamas, where that's really when they talk about de-Hamasification, the sort of standing, the commanding standing heights of the Israeli regime will often try to not talk about Hamas or Islamo-Nazis per se, although it's been during this genocidal campaign of Netanyahu's that he actually said publicly that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was actually more responsible for the idea that becomes Holocaust than Hitler himself. And so it's obvious that the commanding heights of Israel want to pursue a very similar kind of rhetorical warfare against the Palestinians under the guise of de-Hamasification is also then really coded as denazification too. So I think something very similar is going on in relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And sure, there are powerful elements within Ukraine that have some amount of organized, political networking that should be seen or should be, we should have a critical eye toward. But once again, I'll say that I believe in the idea of national sovereignty. Now, obviously, if someone is pursuing a genocide within what they call their national sovereignty, such as I would say that's actually exactly what Israel is doing. It's obvious that Gaza is it's not an actual country. It doesn't have any independence. It doesn't have an actual military. It doesn't have actually any international legal standing as a nation state. And yet Israel is pretending as if it's fighting a war against a sort of a solidified non-state actor, under which they then use this whole aspect of like taking World War II to its conclusions. We have to destroy the Nazis, thus we have to destroy Hamas to the very last one or something like that. And whether or not that includes the rest of the Palestinian people and the rest of their entire infrastructure and their hospitals and their schools and their food and all of that kind of stuff that then is then used as a justification to some kind of total war mechanism. So I see it in a similar kind of way. It's a little bit less it's a lot less escalated in the Russian-Ukrainian theater than it obviously is in terms of Israel and Gaza, because that's more like a Warsaw Ghetto kind of scenario rather than a smaller, less powerful country next door like it is between Russia and Ukraine. But the architecture of the rhetorical warfare in terms of against the Nazi elements is as cynical, I think, in both cases.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's a very good parallel. I mean, like to illustrate, I mean, like, I have no doubt that within probably any of the Palestinian territories, there are Palestinians who probably, understandably, but still not justifiably, would probably have a deep hatred towards all Jews and probably want to see them wiped off the face of the earth. Now, but at the same time, does that justify meaning murdering every single Palestinian in existence? Of course not. Same way within Ukraine. I have no doubt that there are neo-Nazis within Ukraine who have committed violence against those who have probably either spoken out against the war, spoken out for peace, or they've committed violence against whether it's ethnic or linguistic or religious minorities. I don't doubt that, but again, it doesn't mean that somehow every single Ukrainian is a Nazi or shares any neo-Nazi views.
Exactly. And I would also then even flip that around too, in by saying that maybe in the aggressor side of this, or in the stronger side of this, from the Israeli commanding heights and the Russian commanding heights, you can find people who basically try to linguistically dehumanize the entirety of the population in the territory that they are attacking, whether it's in, Dugin talking about Ukrainians as sort of having sort of emerged from the sewers, and, classic what we know as proto-genocidal language in terms of, what we talked about, like people have known about like the Tutsis and the Hutu, and how like people, turning humans into some kind of Untermenschen or a subhuman or non-human. First starting like mass linguistics is a key first step toward a genocide, whether it's a part or in whole or a national genocide. That you have the Dugins expressing this kind of thing toward the Ukrainians really as a whole. You have the elements of the Israeli commanding heights who have expressed something similar at certain points in terms of, there are no innocents in Gaza, and basically sort of painting the whole way that Hamas is painted as a Amalek, as some kind of potential ethnic group that needs to be taken down, or it represents an ethno threat to the Jewish nation to some extent. That there are these people who've said these things, and even then, that doesn't mean that then we should say that either all Israelis are genocidal in their belief system. Though the polling does show that increasingly that it has become almost a majority view or a super majority view in many ways, or that even though there is heavily anti-Ukrainian sentiment in Russia, and including at certain commanding heights in terms of the way that the Ukrainians have been spoken about, that the Russian people should then be seen as all genocidal lunatics or something like that. And then of course then that does not justify then that all Israelis deserve to then be sort of nationally genocided, or all Russians deserve to be nationally genocided, or all any of those kinds of things. So I agree with you in that obviously these problems exist in certain ways. Certain things can be understood and historically justified in how it got to this situation, whether it's in terms of a suspicion against Jews in general amongst the Palestinian population, or if it's a suspicion against the Russian communists or the Russians, ethnic Russians in the Ukrainian context. That these things exist. Some of it can be historically understood, but the answer to it is not military invasion, military occupation, and mass violence against the people of those countries. Well, in this case, in the case of Gaza, they don't even yet have a country.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess my last question would be about Zelensky. Zelensky is obviously he's portrayed by the Russian media, and maybe also by alternative media, as a corrupt authoritarian. I haven't done much of a look into him, but what my own personal suspicion is, I don't doubt that he probably has some corruption like going on within him. But at the same time, what are your own thoughts on this? Now that I remember what else I was going to bring up. It's also brought up by Russia and also alternative media of how Ukraine has literally snatched up its own citizens to be forcibly drafted into their military. Now, I understand why that's happening. I don't think it's a good thing at one bit, but I understand why it's happening, because they're literally facing a major threat. But what are your own thoughts on both, like, Zelensky and also maybe also the issue of corruption in Ukraine?
Yeah, and this is another area where I would leave it more to the experts on the ground, and especially within Ukrainian society, to give the firmest answers to it. But my perspective is sort of similar to yours, I think, from the outside looking in that it's, partially because of the history of Ukraine and how it was in this Netherlands, netherworld between Europe and the Soviet Union and Russia to some extent, that there was this, it was a battle for political influence. We've already talked about the question of the Nazi remnant influence and all of that. But then there's also then this corruption element from the Soviet apparatchik days that I talked about, was actually part of the actual Russian political strategy for maintaining control over the Ukrainian sphere without having to do something like a full, what looks to be like a full military invasion of the territory. So there is there are the questions, like I pointed out before, of the origins of Zelensky, in terms of, it looks like one of his main benefactors was Kolomoisky. And I think it would be interesting to do a deeper dive into the actual background of Kolomoisky and the networks surrounding Zelensky. And it is possible. Look, because of what I talked about before about Zelensky comes out of, certain Russian sphere, at least Russian speaking media networks that interface between, at the very least, between Ukraine and Russia, that it's possible that he was seen by the Russian sphere as a potential manageable asset of some sort. And so I guess my parallel would be is, in a similar kind of way, that after the influence of the Harvard boys and the sort of the, during the aluminum war time of post-Soviet Russia, where things got real chaotic and destabilized and violent on the streets, and then Siloviki and Putin came in as emissaries, really, of a long-standing Russian deep state to sort of turn this back on its feet. I sort of get a similar kind of sense from the Ukrainian side of things, of that there are these elements, that it's bigger than just Zelensky, and that Zelensky is his own person. Sure, he has certain pre-existing compromise and political commitments and monetary relationships with certain obviously sort of corrupt networks of some sort, in a similar kind of way that, like, someone like, any politician in the United States coming in sort of owes their background to their major patrons and their major then political funders and all that kind of thing. But then once the Ukrainian nation state is facing an actual physical invasion by its neighbor, then there is aspects of the actual Ukrainian security state, including, I would say, the commanding heights of what you could call then the Ukrainian deep state, in combination with the organic elements of Ukrainian civil society that are then basically saying, no, we're not going to allow this. We're going to fight back. We're going to do our best to eject them and refuse them their ability to occupy us, and definitely refuse their ability to take us over completely. And downstream of all of that, you also, of course, then have the coercive aspects of drafts and preventing people from leaving, especially men of a certain age and all of that. And of course, Ukraine was already dealing with aspects of demographic decline of some sort. And then obviously once you get a hardcore invasion and military attacks on the country, then a lot of people want to leave, because you don't want to get stuck. You don't want to get killed. You don't want to get involved in some kind of potentially long operation where your country is destroyed or something like that. So certain people are going to leave. So it's only increased the demographic problems of Ukraine. So, of course, as I think both you and I are we're American patriots of conscience, and thus we also have certain commitments to certain ideas about political freedoms and certain civil rights and natural rights as human beings. And at the same time, I think we both can then understand how a country that's being invaded has certain hard decisions to make in terms of, well, who's going to actually help us fight back against this invading aggressor. And so I'll finish up by saying that similar kinds of things then obviously happen in relationship to religion, right? And so the way that the framing of the Zelensky, the Jew, basically, or the Jewish leader of Ukraine is attacking the Orthodox Christian churches or something like that, when it's actually what's going on is the Ukrainian security services have a deep understanding that the Russian Orthodox Church has been a key network all the way back through the Soviet Union, and especially after the end of the Soviet Union, that the Russian Orthodox Church and its emissaries throughout, Orthodox Christianity to some extent, are key places where Russian agents can work their influence and stuff like that. And so, of course, none of that is actually then talked about in a complex and nuanced fashion. That this is not just Zelensky, the Jew president of Ukraine, attacking the poor Orthodox Christians. No, there's part of this that is actually the Ukrainian, I'll say at the upper heights of the commanding deep state, that understand that Russia's political warfare continues on up through their actual military invasion of the country, and that part of the networks of this operate intensely through their pre-existing networks that include elements inside of the religious organizations. Now, this also then I would say, include questions of Chabad Lubavitch in Ukraine, and whether some of those networks actually are then representative of the Kremlin interests via their extension of the Chabad Lubavitch network inside of Ukraine too. So yeah. So I guess I'm saying that, I don't know exactly Zelensky's consciousness. I don't know his level of corruption. All I know is that he seems to have been have taken the line of the national sentiment in Ukraine, especially after they were invaded, and that's why he's being attacked by the Russians. They want him out of there because they believe that he is not a manageable Russian asset to some extent. He's not being offered a trip to Russia after he's allegedly deposed like Yanukovych was. So at the very least, there's some aspect of Zelensky that he has to enough of an extent express the Ukrainian national desire and sentiment enough to be able to maintain his position amongst the Ukrainian security services.
Well, let's see. It's been over 2 hours, but it's been worth every single minute. Jeremy, I greatly appreciate this conversation. If you can, once I stop recording, just stick around for a bit, because I'll send you that link to that docu-series I mentioned to you. But for our listeners, I greatly appreciate you joining for this. This has been Further Inquiry of our 5th episode. I'm probably going to title this maybe, I don't know, an alternate to the alternate view on Russia, Israel, and Ukraine. But thanks again for listening, and stop.